At 7:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944, Brigadier General Norman Cotter stepped off a landing craft into waist-deep water 400 yards from Omaha Beach in Normandy, France, watching soldiers crouched behind a seawall who had stopped moving forward. The soldiers belonged to the 116th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, and the 116th Regiment, 29th Infantry Division. German machine gun fire swept across the beach from concrete bunkers on the bluffs 200 feet above them. Artillery shells exploded in the surf. Bodies floated in the water. Disabled tanks burned on the sand. The entire invasion was collapsing right in front of Cotter's eyes. He was 51 years old, Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division, one of the most senior officers to land in the first waves. The Germans had approximately 12,000 soldiers from the 352nd Infantry Division, with nearly 7,000 Infantry Division combat troops defending this 5-mile stretch of beach. They occupied fortified positions on the high ground with interlocking fields of fire covering every approach. American doctrine said the pre-invasion naval and air bombardment would destroy these defenses. The plan called for 40 minutes of naval gunfire and 30 minutes of heavy bomber strikes to neutralize the German positions before the 1st Infantry touched shore at 6:30 in the morning as the bombardment ended. The American planners believed in firepower. They believed that enough shells and bombs could destroy any defensive position. The numbers supported this belief. Thousands of tons of explosives were going to hit a 5-mile stretch of beach. Nothing could survive that. The Germans would be dead or too stunned to fight effectively. The infantry would walk ashore against minimal resistance. The Germans had a different plan. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had taken command of coastal defences in late 1943. He'd seen what Allied firepower could do in North Africa. He knew the Allies would bombard the beaches before landing. He designed his defences to survive that bombardment. Rommel ordered the construction of massive concrete bunkers with walls 6 feet thick. He positioned them to provide interlocking fields of fire. He built obstacles on the beach, steel barriers and wooden posts topped with mines that would rip open landing craft. He laid thousands of mines in the sand and behind the seawall. He told his officers that the invasion had to be stopped at the waterline. The first 24 hours would decide the war. If the Allies got off the beaches and established a beachhead, German forces would never dislodge them. The Allies had too much material, too many men, too much air power. Once they got ashore in strength, they'd win. So the beach was everything. The beach was where Germany would win or lose. Every defensive position was designed with that in mind. Kill them on the beach. Stop them in the water. Don't let them get inland. But the bombardment had failed. The Navy fired from too far offshore, between 5,000 and 6,000 yards out to avoid German coastal artillery. Most shells overshot their targets and exploded inland. 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 13 destroyers had pounded the beach for 40 minutes. They fired thousands of rounds. The noise was deafening. The flashes lit up the pre-dawn darkness. From offshore, it looked like the entire coast was being obliterated. But the Germans in their concrete bunkers barely felt it. The shells were landing behind them, in the fields and villages inland. The fortifications on the bluffs remained untouched. The air bombardment was equally ineffective. The bombers, flying through heavy cloud cover at high altitude, released their bombs late to avoid hitting the approaching landing craft. 448 B-24 Liberators from the 8th Air Force dropped 13,000 bombs in a 30-minute window. Nearly all landed 1 to 3 miles inland. They killed cows. They cratered empty fields. They destroyed abandoned buildings. They didn't touch a single German bunker on the beach. The bombardiers couldn't see their targets through the clouds. They relied on instruments and timing, but the timing was off. Every bomb aimer added a few extra seconds before release, just to be safe, just to make sure they didn't hit American troops. Those few seconds meant the bombs fell inland. The safety margin that was supposed to protect the infantry doomed them instead. When the first wave of infantry hit Omaha at 6:30, they ran straight into intact German defenses. Company A of the 116th Regiment landed directly in front of a fortified strongpoint at Dog Green sector. The ramp dropped. German machine guns opened fire immediately. 32 men were killed before they left their landing craft. They died in the boat or in the water trying to get out. The ones who made it to the water were loaded down with 60 pounds of equipment. Some drowned in water over their heads. Others were hit by machine gun fire as they struggled toward shore. The company had landed in the worst possible location. A German strongpoint, designated WN-71, sat on the bluff directly overlooking their landing site. The bunker housed 3 machine guns and had perfect fields of fire covering the entire sector. The Germans couldn't miss. They just aimed at the waterline and pulled the triggers. Company A suffered 65% casualties in the first 10 minutes. Within 30 minutes, 96% of the company was dead, wounded, or combat ineffective. Out of over 200 men, fewer than 20 made it across the beach uninjured and combat ready. The company had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit before most of them even reached the sand. Soldiers who made it to the beach found themselves pinned down behind a low seawall with barbed wire blocking their path forward. Without Bangalore torpedoes or wire cutters, they couldn't advance. Without leadership, they wouldn't move. The plan was dying. Soldiers were dying. And Norman Cotter was watching it happen from 200 yards offshore. The problem wasn't that American soldiers didn't know what to do. They knew. Every briefing emphasized it. Get off the beach, move inland, find cover, attack the strong points. The training had been exhaustive. The 1st Infantry Division had fought in North Africa and Sicily. They were veterans. The 29th Division had trained in England for 2 years. They knew their jobs, but knowing what to do and being able to do it are different things. On Omaha Beach that morning, everything that could go wrong did. Landing craft hit sandbars 600 yards from shore and dropped their ramps in deep water. Men carrying 60 pounds of equipment drowned before reaching the beach. Amphibious tanks, designed to swim ashore ahead of the infantry, sank in the rough seas. 27 of 32 DD tanks from the 741st Tank Battalion went straight to the bottom. The infantry arrived without armour support. The Navy coxswains, disoriented by smoke and afraid of German artillery, landed units in the wrong sectors. Entire companies became separated from their officers. Radio equipment got soaked and stopped working. Engineers carrying Bangalore torpedoes were killed before they could clear the wire obstacles. The German fire was murderous. Machine guns fired from concrete casemates that the naval bombardment hadn't scratched. Mortars dropped shells directly onto the landing craft as their ramps went down. Artillery batteries on the high ground had pre-registered coordinates for every square metre of beach. They fired for effect without needing to adjust. The beach became a killing zone. Bodies piled up along the waterline. Wounded men drowned as the tide came in. Equipment littered the sand. Burning vehicles blocked the exits. The noise was overwhelming. Explosions, gunfire, men screaming, the smell of cordite, burning fuel, and death. Every sense told the soldiers the same thing. They were going to die here. So they stopped. They found whatever cover they could. They pressed themselves into the sand behind the seawall and the shingle, and they stayed there because moving meant death. The official plan didn't account for this. The plan assumed the bombardment would work. The plan assumed the tanks would land on time. The plan assumed the engineers would clear the obstacles. The plan assumed leadership would remain intact. The plan assumed soldiers would follow doctrine even when everything fell apart. The plan was a fantasy. By 7 in the morning, 1,600 American soldiers were pinned down on Omaha Beach. None had advanced more than 200 yards inland. The beachhead was 400 yards deep at its deepest point. It should have been 2 miles deep by now. Division headquarters offshore couldn't get accurate reports. Radio communications were failing. Officers were dead or separated from their units. Nobody knew what was happening. Some commanders considered calling off the entire landing. The situation looked hopeless. That's when Norman Cotter arrived. Within the first hour of the landing, Kota witnessed the systematic destruction of American units all around him. Bodies floated in the surf. Wounded men called for medics who couldn't reach them. Equipment was scattered everywhere. Rifles, helmets, packs, ammunition boxes, all abandoned as men fought just to get to cover. An unnamed lieutenant he didn't know was trying to organize a squad behind the seawall when a mortar round landed directly on his position. 4 men died instantly. 3 others were wounded badly enough that they'd die within the hour if they didn't get medical attention. Medical attention wasn't coming. The aid stations were overwhelmed. Medics were being shot wearing their Red Cross armbands. The Germans either didn't care about the Geneva Convention or figured the Red Crosses made good targets. Major Charles Tegtmeier, the regimental surgeon for the 16th Infantry, wrote in his after-action report that the Geneva Convention was a failure. The white brassards drew fire. Company aidmen were being shot intentionally. He watched medics get hit while treating wounded men. The Germans seemed to target them specifically. The beach was divided into sectors with code names: Dog Green, Dog White, Dog Red, Easy Green, Easy Red, Fox Green, Fox Red. Each sector had specific units assigned to land there, but the plan had broken down immediately. Landing craft commanders, blinded by smoke and disoriented by the chaos, put men ashore wherever they could. Units were scattered across the wrong sectors. Officers couldn't find their companies. Companies couldn't find their platoons. The chain of command had disintegrated in the first 10 minutes. Engineers from the 299 Engineer Combat Battalion were trying to emplace a Bangalore torpedo under a section of barbed wire near the Veerville Draw. The Bangalore was 50 feet long, packed with 85 pounds of TNT, assembled by hand under fire. The engineers got the torpedo in position and were connecting the detonator when German machine gun fire killed 2 of them instantly. The 3rd engineer tried to complete the detonation. He was hit before he could set the charge. The Bangalore lay there, useless, while men behind the wire stayed pinned down. Kota watched this happen from 40 yards away. He saw the problem immediately. Without Bangalore torpedoes, there was no way through the wire. Without a way through the wire, there was no way off the beach. Without getting off the beach, everyone was going to die. The doctrine said engineers would clear the obstacles, but the engineers were dead. Doctrine didn't have a backup plan for this. By 7:15, Kota had seen enough. He'd watched too many men die. He'd watched too many soldiers freeze behind inadequate cover. He'd watched the entire invasion stall because nobody was moving, so he started walking. He walked upright across the beach toward the seawall. German fire was everywhere. Bullets snapped past him. Mortar shells landed close enough to throw sand on him. He didn't duck. He didn't run. He walked. When he reached the seawall, he found soldiers from the 116th Infantry Regiment and the 5th Ranger Battalion huddled behind it, soaked, exhausted, terrified. Some had their rifles fouled with sand and water. Others had lost their weapons entirely. They looked at Kota with blank expressions, shell shock, combat fatigue. Whatever you wanted to call it, these men had stopped functioning as soldiers. Kota knelt beside them and spoke clearly. He told them they were being killed on the beaches. He told them they needed to go inland. He told them that staying here meant death just as surely as moving forward did. But at least moving forward gave them a chance. Then he stood up and kept walking. What happened in the next 4 hours would determine whether the Normandy invasion succeeded or failed. The plan had been clear. Get infantry off the beach in the first 30 minutes. Secure the beach exits in the first hour. Move 2 miles inland by noon. Link up with British forces at Gold Beach to the east and American forces at Utah Beach to the west. By nightfall on June 6th, the 1st Infantry Division was supposed to control Colleville-sur-Mer and be pushing toward Bayeux. But plans die when they meet reality. The reality at Omaha Beach was that American forces were stuck. The beach exits, narrow draws through the bluffs, were covered by German strongpoints. Machine guns and mortars had pre-registered fire on every approach. Even if soldiers got through the wire, they'd be slaughtered trying to climb the draws. The Safta 60A2, Germans knew this. They'd spent years fortifying these positions. They'd cleared fields of fire. They'd emplaced obstacles. They'd registered artillery coordinates. Every inch of beach was covered by overlapping fire. The defenses weren't designed to repel every attacker. They were designed to slow the Americans down long enough for German reinforcements to arrive and push them back into the sea. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had inspected these defenses personally. He'd told his officers that the invasion must be stopped at the waterline. Once the Allies established a beachhead and got their armour ashore, German forces wouldn't be able to dislodge them. The beach was the killing zone. The beach was where the war would be decided. Rommel understood this perfectly. So did Kota. The difference was that Kota was standing on the beach with the soldiers who were dying. He wasn't reading reports miles away. He was there, in the middle of it, and he could see exactly what needed to happen. Somebody had to move forward. Somebody had to find a way through the wire. Somebody had to attack those strong points, and that somebody had to be him. At approximately 7:45, Kota found a group of Rangers from the 5th Ranger Battalion pinned down near a section of damaged wire. The wire wasn't completely intact. Naval gunfire had torn a gap in it, maybe 3 feet wide. The gap was under direct fire from a German machine gun position 70 yards up the bluff. Any soldier trying to go through would be cut down immediately. The Rangers knew this. They'd tried twice already. Both times, the first man through was killed instantly. Now they were stuck, waiting for someone else to figure out what to do. Kota walked up to them and asked what unit they belonged to. Someone answered, 5th Rangers. Kota looked at the gap in the wire, looked at the machine gun position, looked back at the Rangers, and said something that became the motto of every Ranger unit that followed. Well, God damn it, Rangers, lead the way. Then he walked through the gap himself. The machine gun didn't fire. Maybe the German gunner was reloading. Maybe he was distracted by fire from a destroyer offshore. Maybe he just didn't see Kota in time. It didn't matter. Kota made it through, turned around, and waved the Rangers forward. They followed him. 12 men made it through the gap before the machine gun opened up again. 2 were hit. The rest scattered and found cover in the tall grass on the slope leading up the bluff. Kota kept moving. He crawled up the slope with the Rangers spread out behind him. When they reached a position where they could see the machine gun bunker, Kota directed suppressing fire, while 2 Rangers worked their way around to the flank. They got close enough to throw grenades through the bunker's firing slit. The machine guns stopped. That was the first German strongpoint cleared on Omaha Beach. The time was 8:04 in the morning, 1 hour. And 34 minutes after the first wave landed, Kota's action did something the naval bombardment and the airstrikes hadn't done. It showed the soldiers on the beach that the German defenses could be beaten. If Kota could walk through the wire and knock out a machine gun bunker, then so could they. Word spread along the beach. A general had broken through near Vierville. Men started moving. Not in organized units, not according to the plan, but in small groups. A squad here, a fire team there. Soldiers who'd been frozen by fear 10 minutes earlier suddenly found themselves following sergeants and lieutenants who decided it was time to stop dying on the beach and start killing Germans inland. By 8:30, Bangalore torpedoes were being emplaced successfully. Engineers who'd survived the initial landings started clearing wire obstacles. They worked under covering fire from riflemen who'd organized themselves into ad hoc fire teams. The engineers would slide a Bangalore torpedo under the wire, connect the sections, arm the detonator, shout a warning, and detonate the charge. The explosion would blow a gap 4 meters wide. Infantry would pour through before the Germans could react. Then the process would repeat 50 yards further up the beach. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't according to plan. But it worked. Kota didn't stop with one bunker. He kept moving up and down the beach for the next 3 hours. He'd find a unit that was stuck, assess the problem, and either solve it himself or direct someone else to solve it. His presence alone changed the dynamic. Soldiers saw a general walking upright under fire and realized that if he could do it, maybe they could too. At one point, he came across soldiers pinned down by a German sniper in a church steeple in Vierville. The sniper had a clear view of the beach exit and was picking off anyone who tried to advance. Men were dying one by one as they attempted to move up the draw. Kota found a soldier with a bazooka, pointed at the steeple, and told him to shoot it. The soldier looked at him like he was crazy. "Shoot a church?" Kota repeated the order. The soldier fired 3 rounds. The first 2 missed. The third one hit the steeple. The sniper stopped firing. The draw was open. Near the Les Moulins draw, Kota encountered Company C of the 116th Infantry Regiment huddled behind the sea wall. They'd been there for 90 minutes. Their company commander was dead. Their executive officer was wounded. Nobody was giving orders. The men just sat there, waiting for someone to tell them what to do. Kota organized them into 2 groups, designated one sergeant as acting commander, and personally led them through a gap in the wire that engineers had just blown open. He didn't ask them to follow. He didn't give them a choice. He just started walking, and they went with him because the alternative was sitting on the beach waiting to die. When they reached the base of the bluff, he pointed toward a German machine gun position and told them to take it out. They did, not because they suddenly became brave, but because Kota had shown them it was possible. The German positions could be taken. The bunkers could be destroyed. They just had to move. On the eastern end of the beach near Fox Green, Kota found a group of soldiers arguing about whether to wait for tank support or advance on foot. The tanks that hadn't sunk were still down on the beach, trying to find routes through the obstacles. The soldiers were using the absence of armor as an excuse not to move. Kota settled the argument by walking past them toward the German positions. He didn't say anything. He just went. The soldiers followed. They didn't have a choice. A general was walking into enemy fire. If they didn't follow him, they'd look like cowards. So they went. Kota led them up the bluff to a German trench line. The Germans saw them coming and opened fire. The Americans went to ground, found cover, and started shooting back. They cleared the trench with grenades and rifle fire. It took 20 minutes. 3 Americans died, but the trench was theirs, and the Germans fell back to the next line of defense. The technique Kota used wasn't revolutionary. It wasn't some brilliant tactical innovation. He simply led from the front. He showed the soldiers what needed to be done by doing it himself. Where other officers shouted orders from behind cover, Kota walked upright under fire. Where other officers waited for supporting units to arrive, Kota attacked with whoever was nearby. Where other officers tried to reorganize their units according to the plan, Kota grabbed whatever soldiers he could find and used them. The effect was immediate and profound. Soldiers who'd been paralyzed by fear started moving when they saw a 51-year-old general walking through machine gun fire like he was inspecting a parade ground. It wasn't rational. It wasn't doctrine. It was pure leadership by example. Junior officers who'd lost their commanders started making decisions instead of waiting for orders. If a general could make decisions under fire without perfect information, then so could they. They stopped waiting for the situation to match the plan and started dealing with the situation as it actually was. Sergeants who'd been trying to keep their men alive by keeping them behind cover started thinking about how to attack. They realized that staying put was just as dangerous as moving forward. Maybe more dangerous. At least movement gave them a chance to do something about the machine guns that were killing them. The psychology of the beach changed. For 2 hours, the psychological momentum had been all German. They were dug in. They had good fields of fire. They were killing Americans by the hundreds. Every man who tried to advance was cut down. Every attack was stopped. The Germans were winning, and everyone knew it. The Americans were disorganized, leaderless, and dying. They had no momentum. They had no hope. They were just trying to survive the next 5 minutes. The idea of actually getting off the beach and attacking the German positions seemed impossible. But Kota's presence changed the equation. He didn't just organize attacks. He changed what soldiers believed was possible. He showed them that the Germans could be beaten, not by brilliant tactics or overwhelming firepower, but by simple determination, by refusing to accept that the situation was hopeless, by walking forward and trusting others to follow. By 9 in the morning, small groups of American infantry were fighting their way up the bluffs all along Omaha Beach. They weren't moving according to the plan. The plan had died at 6:30 when the first wave landed. But they were moving, and that's what mattered. The breakthrough wasn't coordinated. There was no central command directing the assault. Radio communications were still failing. Officers still couldn't talk to each other. Units were still scattered and disorganized. But individual squads and platoons were making their own decisions. A sergeant would see a gap in the wire and lead his men through it. A lieutenant would spot a German position and organize an attack with whoever was nearby. Engineers would blow a path through the obstacles, and infantry would pour through before the Germans could react. The Germans had prepared for a coordinated assault. They'd planned their defenses to stop organized attacks by battalion or regiment-sized units. They'd registered their artillery on likely approach routes. They'd positioned their machine guns to create killing zones that would stop any frontal assault. But the Americans weren't attacking frontally anymore. They weren't moving in organized units. They were infiltrating. Small groups finding weak points, exploiting gaps, getting behind the German strongpoints, and attacking them from unexpected directions. The German defenders found themselves taking fire from positions they thought were secure. Machine gun bunkers that had dominated the beach suddenly had American infantry throwing grenades through their rear access doors. Artillery observers who'd been directing fire onto the beach found themselves fighting off infantry attacks on their observation posts. By 9:30, the German defensive line wasn't a line anymore. It was a series of isolated strongpoints surrounded by Americans who were bypassing them and pushing inland. Some strongpoints continued fighting, others surrendered. Others were simply abandoned as their defenders realized they were cut off and ran for the rear. The Germans began noticing the change by mid-morning. At regimental headquarters, Colonel Ernst Goth, commanding the 916 Grenadier Regiment of the 352nd Infantry Division, received reports from all along the beach defenses. American troops were pushing inland despite heavy casualties. His strongpoints near Vierville and Colville were under coordinated assault. Goth's headquarters was at Trevieres, several miles inland from the beach. He couldn't see what was happening, but he could hear it. The radio reports painted a picture of American forces that were supposed to be pinned down on the beach, suddenly attacking with ferocity his men hadn't expected. The 352nd Division's defensive plan had been based on keeping the Americans pinned on the beach until German armored reserves could arrive and counterattack. The panzers were supposed to roll down to the coast, push the invaders back into the sea, and end the invasion in a single day. That's what Rommel had promised. That's what the plan called for. But the armor wasn't coming. Allied air superiority meant German reinforcements couldn't move during daylight without being destroyed. Fighter bombers patrolled every road. Any German column that tried to advance toward the coast was spotted from the air and attacked. The troops at Omaha were on their own. Goth ordered his company commanders to hold their positions. He told them reinforcements would arrive by nightfall. They just needed to keep the Americans contained for another 10 hours. Just hold until dark. Then the panzers would come. Then they'd counterattack. Then they'd push the Americans back. But his company commanders were already reporting ammunition shortages. The naval bombardment hadn't destroyed the bunkers, but it had disrupted supply lines. Roads were cratered. Communication lines were cut. Supply trucks couldn't get through. German soldiers were down to a few hundred rounds per machine gun. Mortar teams were rationing shells. Artillery batteries were running low. And the Americans just kept coming. The German defenders had done everything right. They'd built strong fortifications. They'd prepared their fields of fire. They'd trained for this moment. They'd killed hundreds of Americans in the first hour. By every tactical measure, they were winning. But they were still losing because the Americans refused to quit. At 10:20, one of Goth's strongpoints was overrun. American infantry from the 5th Ranger Battalion attacked from 3 directions simultaneously. They used rifle grenades to suppress the bunker's firing ports, then assaulted with grenades and satchel charges. The Americans took 24 prisoners. The Vierville draw was open. German officers watching from inland positions couldn't believe what they were seeing. American soldiers who'd been pinned down on the beach were now attacking fortified positions with a ferocity that seemed suicidal. The Americans weren't using clever tactics. They were just advancing relentlessly, accepting casualties, and grinding through the defenses by sheer determination. By 11 in the morning, 3 of the 5 beach exits were in American hands. Infantry from the 1st Infantry Division and 29th Infantry Division were moving inland toward Colville-sur-Mer and Vierville. The time of the 1st. Beachhead was no longer at risk of collapsing. The invasion would succeed. German commanders recognized this. At 11:30, General Dietrich Kreis, commanding the 352nd Infantry Division, reported to General Marks at 84th Corps headquarters that his forces could no longer contain the American penetration. He requested permission to withdraw to prepared defensive positions 3 kilometers inland. Permission was denied. Hitler had personally ordered that every meter of French soil be defended. Retreat was forbidden. So Kreis's soldiers stayed in their positions and died as American infantry cleared them one by one. The psychological effect on German troops was severe. For 2 years, they'd been told the Atlantic Wall was impregnable. They'd spent months building fortifications. They'd trained for the invasion. They knew their fields of fire. They had good defensive positions. And it hadn't mattered. The Americans had landed anyway, despite horrific casualties, despite the advantages of terrain and fortification, despite everything the Germans threw at them, the Americans had broken through. German soldiers began surrendering in larger numbers after noon. At 1:30 in the afternoon, an entire platoon from the 726 Grenadier Regiment surrendered to a single American sergeant near Colville. They'd run out of ammunition and saw no point in dying for positions that were already being bypassed. By mid-afternoon, German resistance at Omaha Beach had collapsed. Small pockets continued fighting, but the defensive line was broken. American forces controlled the bluffs and were pushing inland. Supply ships were beginning to unload on the beach. Reinforcements were coming ashore. The battle for Omaha was over. The battle for Normandy was just beginning. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The 1st Infantry Division suffered 1,164 casualties on June 6th, including 186 killed. The 29th Division lost 743 men, with 328 killed. Attached Ranger units lost 135. Engineers, naval personnel, and attached units pushed the total American casualties at Omaha to approximately 2,400, with roughly 700 killed. The 116th Infantry Regiment, which led the first wave, lost 971 men killed, missing, or wounded. 27% of their strength. Gone in one day. Some companies were virtually destroyed. Officers and sergeants who'd trained together for months died together in minutes. The town of Bedford, Virginia, sent 46 men to war as part of Company A of the 116th Regiment. 19 of them died on June 6th. 3 more died later in the campaign. Bedford suffered the highest per capita D-Day loss of any American community. The entire town mourned. Nearly every family had lost someone. Captain Emerald Ralston's medical company tried to land at 8:30. Their landing craft was hit by artillery fire. The boat caught fire. 20 medics jumped into the water. Most drowned, pulled under by their equipment. Ralston made it ashore with 12 survivors out of 90 men. 80% casualties before they even touched the beach. They had no medical supplies. Everything went down with the landing craft. So they worked as litter bearers all day, carrying wounded up and down the bluffs under sniper fire. They used whatever they could find. Bandages from dead medics, morphine from casualty clearing stations. They saved lives with their bare hands and whatever scraps of equipment they could scavenge. Staff Sergeant Arnold Lambert established a battalion aid station on Fox Green Beach behind a concrete obstacle. The concrete slab, barely 3 feet high, was the only cover available. Lambert worked there for 14 hours straight, treating over 300 wounded men. He worked without proper supplies, without proper shelter, under constant fire. Wounded men were brought to him faster than he could treat them. He did triage on the beach. Save who you can, Make the others comfortable. Move on to the next one. Lambert was awarded the Bronze Star. He survived the war and lived to be 100 years old. He died in 2021, one of the last surviving D-Day medics. He never talked much about that day. When people asked him how he did it, how he kept going for 14 hours straight while men died around him, he'd say he just did his job. That's all. Just his job. The names of the men who died are carved on memorials at the Normandy American Cemetery. 27 Pennsylvania members of the 1st Infantry Division are buried there. 3 were from Northampton County: Private Leonard Groger, Private Franklin Sullivan, Private John Svetech, all killed on June 6th. Groger was a machinist from Bethlehem. Sullivan was from Easton. Svetech was 19 years old. Their families received telegrams. The War Department regrets to inform you that your son was killed in action on June 6, 1944, in France. The telegrams didn't explain that the plan had failed. They didn't mention that the bombardment missed its targets. They didn't say that the soldiers had been left to die on a beach until a general walked through machine gun fire and shamed them into advancing. The telegrams just said killed in action, and the families mourned. Norman Cotter survived D-Day. He continued leading from the front throughout the Normandy campaign. He didn't change his style. He still walked around under fire. He still personally led attacks when his subordinates hesitated. His soldiers knew that if Cotter was there, they had to perform. You couldn't hide behind excuses when the general was standing right next to you taking the same fire. On July 18, 1944, he was wounded by shrapnel during the battle for St. Lo. The injury wasn't severe enough to evacuate him. Shrapnel tore into his leg and arm. Medics patched him up at a field hospital. He returned to duty within days, still limping but refusing to stay in the rear. On August 14th, he was promoted to command of the 28th Infantry Division after its previous commander was relieved for poor performance. The 28th had been mauled in the Normandy hedgerows. Their casualties were high. Their morale was low. They needed a commander who could restore their fighting spirit. Cotter did exactly that. He led the 28th Division through the liberation of Paris, into Belgium, and across the German border. His division was one of the first Allied units to enter Germany. They fought through the Siegfried Line. They took German towns and villages one at a time. The 28th Division became known as a hard-fighting unit under Cotter's leadership. In December 1944, the 28th Division was hit hard during the Battle of the Bulge. They were defending a thinly held section of the Ardennes forest, a quiet sector where exhausted units went to rest and new divisions got their first taste of combat. 28 miles of front held by 3 regiments spread thin. It seemed safe. The Germans weren't expected to attack there. Then 3 German panzer divisions attacked on December 16th. The weight of the assault fell directly on Cotter's division. They were outnumbered 5-1. They were outgunned. They had no hope of holding. But Cotter's division didn't break. They fought. They delayed the German advance for 2 critical days. Individual units held crossroads and bridges far longer than anyone thought possible. Some fought until they were overrun. Some fought until they ran out of ammunition. But they bought time. That delay, those 2 days, allowed American reinforcements to arrive and establish defensive positions at Bastogne and St. Vith. The German offensive was stopped. The Battle of the Muftings-Fent was oti. Bulge was won because units like the 28th Division refused to collapse when they were supposed to. Cotter's division was nearly destroyed. They took massive casualties. But they delayed the German advance long enough for the counterattack to be organized. Cotter himself organized the defense personally, moving from unit to unit under fire, just like he had at Omaha Beach. Same style, same leadership, same results. Cotter was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions on D-Day. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy while serving as Assistant Division Commander, 29th Infantry Division, in action against enemy forces on June 6, 1944. General Cotter landed on the beach, shortly after the first assault wave of troops had landed. At this time, the beach was under heavy enemy rifle, machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire. Numerous casualties had been suffered, the attack was arrested, and disorganization was in process. With complete disregard for his own safety, General Cotter moved up and down the fire, swept beach reorganizing units and coordinating their action. Under his leadership, a vigorous attack was launched that successfully overran the enemy positions and cleared the beaches. Brigadier General Cotter's superb leadership, personal bravery and zealous devotion to duty exemplify the highest traditions of the military forces of the United States and reflect great credit upon himself, the 29th Infantry Division, and the United States Army. The citation doesn't mention that he walked through machine gun fire. It doesn't say that he personally led the first successful assault off the beach. It doesn't explain that he spent 4 hours moving from unit to unit, organizing attacks, directing fire, and showing soldiers by example that the German defenses could be broken. But the soldiers who were there knew. After the war, there was a campaign to award Cotter the Medal of Honor. Many officers and enlisted men who served under him at Omaha wrote letters supporting the upgrade. They argued that his actions on June 6th had saved the invasion and deserved the nation's highest award. The campaign failed. The Distinguished Service Cross was never upgraded. The official explanation was that the Medal of Honor required witnessed acts of heroism against armed enemy forces that went beyond the call of duty. Cotter's actions, while heroic, were considered within the scope of his responsibilities as a general officer. Norman Cotter retired from the Army in 1946 as a Major General. He returned to the United States, settled in Kansas, and lived quietly. He married Alice Weeks McCutcheon in October 1970. He died on October 4, 1971, at age 78. He was buried at West Point, where he'd graduated in April 1917. His tombstone is simple. It lists his name, rank, and dates of service. It doesn't mention Omaha Beach. It doesn't say that he personally led the breakthrough that saved the D-Day invasion. It doesn't explain that thousands of soldiers followed him up those bluffs because he showed them it could be done. The official Army histories barely mention him. Stephen Ambrose wrote about him in D-Day, June 6, 1944. Gordon Harrison mentioned him briefly in Cross-Channel Attack, the official Army history. Joseph Balkowski featured him prominently in Beyond the Beachhead, a history of the 29th Division. But most Americans have never heard of Norman Cotter. In 2023, soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division returned to Omaha Beach for the 79th anniversary of D-Day. They stood at the memorial overlooking the beach. They looked down at the sand where their predecessors had died. One sergeant, First Sergeant Michael Brockman, said, "The 1st Infantry Division is the most historic unit we have. It all gets put into perspective when you come out and see the things they've seen and touched the places they've touched. The 1st Infantry Division fought in North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, the Ardennes, and across Germany. They liberated cities. They defeated German divisions. They suffered 20,659 casualties during the war, more than any other American division in Europe. They paid for victory in blood. But Omaha Beach was the moment when the war's outcome hung in the balance, not the entire war, but the invasion itself. If the Americans had been pushed back into the sea at Omaha, the entire operation would have been compromised. The British and Canadian beaches to the east, Gold, Juno, and Sword, had achieved their objectives with lighter casualties. They'd gotten off the beaches. They'd moved inland. But they were isolated. Utah Beach to the west was also successful, but it was too far away to link up quickly. If Omaha had failed, there would have been a 30-mile gap in the Allied line. The Germans could have concentrated their reserves against the isolated British and Canadian forces. They could have pushed them back to the sea sector by sector. The entire invasion could have collapsed. Even if the Allies held their beachheads, losing Omaha would have meant losing the deep water port facilities they needed. Without Omaha secured, supplies couldn't flow inland fast enough. The logistics would have strangled the advance. The liberation of Europe would have been delayed by months, maybe years. Stalin was already suspicious that the Western Allies were delaying the Second Front deliberately. Another failed invasion might have convinced him to seek a separate peace with Germany. The alliance that won the war could have fractured. The strategic consequences of failure at Omaha were catastrophic. Everything depended on getting off that beach, and for 2 hours it looked impossible. But Omaha didn't fail. Not because the plan worked. The plan failed spectacularly. Omaha succeeded because soldiers like Norman Cota refused to accept failure, because when the plan died, they improvised, because when their officers were killed, they led themselves, because when staying on the beach meant death, they chose to move forward. Wars are won through the courage of individual soldiers who make the right decision at the critical moment. On June 6, 1944, when everything was falling apart and the invasion was on the verge of collapse, Norman Cota stood up and led. Thousands of soldiers followed him, not because they were ordered to, not because the plan said to, but because someone showed them it was possible. Cota walked forward under fire and trusted that others would follow. The invasion succeeded because of it. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters, each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below, telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching and thank you for keeping these stories alive.